What does radio and Kleenex have in common? Hi, this is Scott Howard, also known as ScLoHo, with a fresh episode of the Genuine ScLoHo Media and Marketing Podcast. I record these just about every week at the Federated Media Studios in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I work for WOWO, that's WOWO Radio, and a couple of our sister stations. And this is an ongoing collection of media, marketing, and personal insights that I've been sharing in podcast form since 2017. This episode, number 385, is the audio version of my latest article, which I published at my own personal website, scotthoward.me. Altogether, I published over 1,600 articles, and this one is titled, Nobody Calls It Facial Tissue. Can you pass me a facial tissue, please? Says nobody. We ask for a Kleenex. However, just because we ask for a Kleenex and our friends hands us one or a whole box of them, odds are that they are not really Kleenex. They could be Puffs brand or a store brand of facial tissue. Kleenex is a brand like Puffs, and yet it's lost its distinction as a brand to the general public. The point is Kleenex has become a standard substitute name for any kind of facial tissue. According to some data I looked up, Kleenex branded facial tissue is only around 30%, meaning 7 out of 10 of us are using some other brand, but most of us are still calling it Kleenex. Now, this article isn't really about Kleenex, however. It's about the limited ability of consumers to identify certain things that we use regularly. And it's because I'm a media guy, that's where we're going with this. I was talking recently about the different ways that we consume media in 2025 with a friend and how we have multiple options to get news, information, and entertainment, which continues to expand. Generally, that expansion has been good, however, not always. Take, for example, newspapers. These are the original mass media that allowed the same information to be distributed to the masses, and all was good for a few hundred years. Many communities of all sizes had one or more newspapers that printed regularly. Daily was a favorite, some did weekly, but as long as they had the right combination of news articles and advertisements to be profitable, all was good. 100 years ago, in the 1920s, radio broadcasting began spreading as a mass media, and then in the 1950s and 60s, broadcast television also grew. Broadcasting both competed and complemented newspapers. Businesses could advertise on all of them or some of them. However, in my lifetime, all three coexisted for a long, long time. Until the advent of the internet and personal computers in the 1990s, and then we started to see the decline of newspapers that has been a slow, painful death for so many papers in the United States. Let's talk about television or TV. Adding pictures to audio and broadcasting to the masses used to be a simple business model. It was expensive and needed government regulation, but broadcast TV became the dominant mass media as consumers bought TVs and the family could watch together in the living room or family room. Some families had multiple televisions. My dad worked for Magnavox in the 1960s and 70s, which at the time was a leading consumer electronics company. So we had 2 TVs at my house when I was a teenager. There's also been a couple of disruptors. Cable TV was the first, along with satellite TV. They both brought in out-of-town signals and hundreds of viewing options besides watching live local broadcast TV. VCRs, or video cassette recorders, became a home entertainment option that allowed viewers to time shift when they watched their favorite shows too. As improvements and advancements in technology and the internet have continued, the reliance of broadcast TV is being challenged. I first noticed my millennial kids had stopped watching any form of local broadcast TV when they became parents, and the screens, both the ones that hang on their walls and the personal ones like tablets, phones, and laptops, they were not tuned in to ABC, CBS, Fox, NBC, or PBS, which were the channels that those kids watched when they were kids. The internet, again, was the big disruptor, and the challenge for both newspaper and broadcast TV was not just readers and viewers, but also financial. Businesses buy advertising on these mediums, and that revenue keeps the papers printing and your favorite shows on the air. Yet you also pay for a newspaper, and we become accustomed to a subscription service to watch stuff. But in most cases, you needed the right combination of audience and advertisers to stay in business. Many newspapers created a paywall, and originally there were a lot of resistance because the common thinking was the internet was free. Well, as younger generations have not experienced the free media that their parents and grandparents expected and experienced, we're seeing a growing acceptance of paying for services online. Radio. You may have noticed I skipped over the details of radio. That's because I want to really give it some focus and because I believe it's deserving of some extra attention. Broadcast radio's heyday was in the earlier days, some would say. My primary radio station, WOWO, turned 100 on March 31st this year. And it's not the same radio station it was originally. I've only been around for the last 65 years of WOWO, but let's just say the last 50 because my family wasn't living in Fort Wayne when I was born, and it wasn't really until my teenage years that I caught the radio bug that led me to pursue working as a radio personality and radio disc jockey. Generally speaking, the past 5 decades, many radio stations have transitioned as technology also transitioned. What I grew up listening to was music stations with DJs playing recorded music from vinyl records. Then, compact discs replaced vinyl records and were the first forms of digital music, but they still required a physical disc to hold the recorded music. It was similar to records, but different too. By the way, magnetic tape was the standard for recording before digital, and we had special tape players called carts at radio stations that we could load a song or a commercial or a jingle on. Meanwhile, in the consumer world, something that looks similar to the carts we used in professional world, 8-track tape players were thought to be a threat to radio stations, as many cars had 8-track players, and then cassette players, which made listening to a record portable. Those tapes may have had a small impact on radio listenership, but they never really became a complete substitute. Same thing with CDs. By the way, my 2012 Mercedes has both a CD player and Bluetooth options, along with the AM/FM radio options. Radio listenership moved from the AM band to the FM band starting in the late 70s and early 80s as the sound quality of FM and the growth of FM receivers grew, and many AM radio stations' audience size as a result declined, and locally, WOWO radio on the AM dial at 1190 was finally beaten in the ratings by rival WMEE-FM during this time. I was part of the WMEE-FM air staff that knocked WOWO off the throne around 1981 or 82. What has saved the radio stations has been the programming changes that they've made over time, too. Around 30 years ago, WOWO at 1190 AM transitioned to become a full-time talk radio station. Many AM stations around the country dropped playing music full-time to move to some form of talk. The content of what these radio stations were playing as talk stations attracted an audience and kept many struggling AM stations alive. Now, when I say talk radio, that's another industry term would be spoken word. Whatever you call it, it's people who are talking on the radio instead of people singing on the radio, as I explained to others. There are many variations of talk radio, including what we do at WOWO, which is news talk with some occasional sports broadcasts. I also represent a full-time sports talk station. There are a bunch of religious talk stations and some Spanish language talk stations around the country. Odds are that if you listen to an AM radio station, it will feature some form of talk programming. Now, what does any of this have to do with Kleenex and facial tissue? Hang on, because here's where I'm going to tie it all together. WOWO and other radio stations now have multiple ways for listeners to listen to them. For WOWO radio, you can listen on 1190 AM. We also added a full-time FM signal that broadcasts most everything that you hear on WOWO AM. That's heard at 92.3 FM, which is legally known as WFWI. 107.5 FM It's a low-power signal, legally known as W298BJ, and if you have an HD radio, 97.3 HD2 FM, which is WMEE HD2, is also known as WOWO. All of the above are broadcast signals that carry WOWO programming. The internet has also given us multiple ways to listen to WOWO via what we call streaming. Some of you have a smart speaker named Alexa. You can ask Alexa to play WOWO radio. I use Google in my home office for my smart speaker. And if I say, hey Google, play WOWO radio, I get WOWO. You can go to the WOWO.com website and listen to the WOWO stream on your computer, phone, or tablet. There are plenty of apps that you can load to your device or your smart TV that also carry the WOWO programming. See, WOWO is more than a set of call letters. WOWO is a brand, and for the past 30 years, that brand has been conservative news talk radio. While we carry some national shows, we also carry local content, including our Fort Wayne morning news, 20 hours a week from 5 to 9 a.m. Monday through Friday. Also, between 5 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, there's 13 hours where we have local news broadcasts. Plus, our regional afternoon host for 15 hours a week is another local WOWO exclusive. Unlike Kleenex, WOWO is unique. You cannot find a substitute way of listening to our content. However, like I said, there are many ways you can listen to the WOWO content. Facial tissue, on the other hand, is not unique, and if you have to blow your nose or need something to sneeze into, nearly any brand will do. While I get data about all of the local radio stations from a couple of different rating and research companies, some of it you'll have to step back and think like a real person. See, a client of mine and I were talking a couple days ago, and he told me that no one has ever told him that they listened to WOWO's stream. That's not surprising because a real person listening to the WOWO brand doesn't put much thought into the technology that they're using to listen. Next to nobody except people in our industry would know what the WOWO stream even is. To most people, it's just WOWO. I've already listed all the ways that a listener can listen to WOWO, and that's all that matters. Now, if the question, do you ever listen to WOWO with your Alexa, was asked, I'm sure some people would say yes. Many of us listen multiple ways. A national study that I've got linked to my article on my website to this article that I'm talking to you or reading to you and sharing with you right now shows that advertisers are probably missing a portion of a radio station listeners if their ads are not also played on that station's stream. Now, the numbers I have specifically for WOWO come from a couple of years ago that showed at least 30% of WOWO listeners are listening to the WOWO stream. I don't know if that is in addition to listening to the WOWO on AM or FM radio, or if they listen to the WOWO stream exclusively, but it's grown to a significant portion of our listenership that in most radio campaigns, I'm going to include streaming as a recommendation. One last piece to what makes WOWO successful is that along with the fantastic programming content that attracts thousands of local listeners every week, WOWO's advertising sales team is top-notch too. Unless Federated Media, our parent company, had the financial income to support the continued programming content and the expenses to operate, WOWO would have died years ago. The only way Federated Media can continue is by earning money, and that's by selling advertising that connects our listeners to businesses and organizations. We're doing that in such a way that is profitable for the businesses to continue while we provide connections to trustworthy advertisers to our listeners. I used to lead our sales team for WOWO and a couple of our other radio stations, and then a couple of years ago stepped away from management to return to being a member of the sales team that can help you directly connect with the WOWO radio listeners. If you have any questions about advertising and marketing, whether it's radio, TV, anything, social, online, ask me. I'll be glad to help you out. Email me. Scott@WOWO.com is my email address. That's Scott Howard. The email is scott@WOWO.com.
Podcasts by Federated Media.